Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for everybody who's made it to this month's edition. For the uninitiated, BètaBreak is a student-led committee at the UFA whose main aim is to make science accessible, as well as discuss and problematize science-adjacent topics. We host monthly or bi-monthly panels about an array of topics and invite speakers in different fields to guide us through them. Today's talk is heavily focused on media and how it mediates our experience of the world and therefore how we interact with it and live in it. In that, we want to offer a different perspective to the sciences, which often only offers one particular objective view of how we should view the world. We'll start by defining some key terms, then discuss some of the most prominent scientific instruments of our time, and end by contextualizing them through a more historical and reflective lens. But before delving deeper into this, we would like to introduce our wonderful speakers for today. First, we have Erinç at the end of the table. They're the head of humanities at the Amsterdam University College. They teach media-related courses such as perspectives on games and media environment. And then we have Sebastian, who's an assistant professor of media studies at the VU. They teach courses about media and culture, such as mediating environments and aesthetics of media environments. But we would also like to allow the speakers to introduce themselves properly. So we'd like to give the floor to Erinç.
Hello. Can people hear us back there? Okay, because we have trouble hearing you, I think.
Oh, okay.
But that's fine. Hi, I don't know what more I can say to introduce myself. I work across the street at University College. I teach courses on media and environment and video games. I'm very excited to be here and chat with Sebastian.
Yeah, I'm excited too. So thanks for the invitation. Thanks for organizing this. My name is Sebastian Scholz. I work at the VU, so at the infamous Saudas, not far from here. In programs that are media, design, architecture, and art, and arts and culture. And I'm basically interested in the relations of media and environments, mainly doing research on sensors, sensor media lately, but in general, like beyond that, I'm fascinated by how we mediate environments and how environments themselves mediate certain things.
Thank you so much. Also very quickly, my name is Farah and I'm a student at the Amsterdam University College. I'm a humanities major and I've taken many classes in media and literature.
And I'm Harry. I'm also from AUC, and it was because of Erinç's course, Media Environment, that we decided to make this topic because we thought it had a lot of interesting connections between the sciences and the humanities. And so I think we should just get right into our discussion today. And as I can imagine, a lot of the people in our audience aren't media students. But so first, I think we can start by introducing some of the terms that could be relevant to our discussion today. And so I think one of the big ones, and one of the most obvious ones, is media. It's a very turbulent term. So Erinç, could I first ask you how you would define media?
Well, we were preparing for this. I think we were both worried that every question is going to be a talk in itself, and I'll try to not turn it into that. Media studies is fascinating and interesting, and I love it as a discipline. And one of the reasons that is the case is, as a field, media studies has a contentious and problematic relationship with its supposed object, which is media. Media scholars across decades and from different parts of the fields have vehement disagreement about what they mean by media. So there is no correct answer to that question, and it depends on your definition of media that you get a different media studies out of. So in that way, I can only give you a working definition that I will try to come back to during today's conversation that's going to inform how I'm going to address the rest of this conversation. And that is, media is, etymologically, is anything that's in between. So you can think of that as speaker and receiver, noise and meaning. Something is in between. And that thing in between is the domain of media studies, whatever that looks like. Sometimes that looks like language. Sometimes that looks like what we consider to be a piece of technology, whether that be a computer or a dictionary or a cuneiform tablet. all of that is media studies, but also any kind of meaning making that humans use and create and work with is the domain of media studies. That also means, pivoting into environment, you can open that up to anything outside of the human domain that is also in between things can be the domain of media studies. If that sounds extremely ambitious, bordering on vague, yes, but that also makes it exciting. That is my rambly answer. Would you feel like to? Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, I think basically we agree on what media can be, that media are a lot. They are not just technologies, they are that, but more than that. They are not just a cultural form, they are that, but more than that. So you could add to that list. And for a very long time, media studies was kind of like limited by thinking too much in like the so-called blood groups of like you either identify as a film scholar or a television scholar or a new media scholar. And I'm glad that this is more and more disappearing, these like artificial boundaries, because, well, we still have programs, of course, dedicated to one of those specific media, but I think the question of media specificity has turned from being like disciplinary limitations and sitting in those silos, not communicating with one another, to a broader take on what media in general are and what can turn into media. It's not a fixed object, it is not always clear from the start. So, well, just anecdotically, maybe, if you have a German background like me, as you may spot from the accent, it is part of your education in most programs to reflect on what media are in the first place. You spend a lot of time before actually going into analysis of any specific object to really reflect on what media are, what they can be, how things become media at a certain point. And so like in a PhD, for example, in a German media studies program, you will probably like spend the first 3 chapters of your PhD, first of all, defining what it is that you call media in that respect. It's a complicated term. So you started basically for media scholars probably with the most like obvious, but also the most difficult question to answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your input. And of course, we know this is a famously difficult question. But you bring up some very interesting points about how media sort of operates at the boundary between objects and how it can encompass a lot of things that seem either to be cultural or to be natural. And so I think, as is relevant to the pursuits of science, which is often the study of nature, we were wondering if you could talk a bit more about this boundary between nature and culture that can be mediated. Maybe would you like to start, Sebastian?
I mean, of course, within the humanities, and that is certainly not limited to media studies, of course, this is an ongoing discussion, or like the divide between the binary opposition of nature and culture has been under a lot of pressure like for a long, long time now. And then the question is, of course, on which side of this divide, when you merge it into something that is called nature cultures, where does that put media in this constellation? And of course, there have been attempts of rephrasing that or adding to the nature culture concept by, for example, people like Jussi Parikka, whose work I really appreciate a lot and use a lot in my own work, provocatively calling it media natures, so like a compositum of those 2 terms, like nature cultures. So the media natures, because media come from nature, all the elements in media, the raw materials that define technologies, media technologies, are kind of out of nature, extractivist logics behind that. Also because it has an impact on nature. It leaves traces in nature. If you think of e-waste and having to replace your phone every so many years because of obsolescence and things like that. So we'll have to take care of that as well. And at the same time, like in between those ends of production and waste, there's of course numerous relations of media and environments. The way we experience our environments are of course heavily defined by media, by the use of media. If you just think, I mentioned before that I'm fascinated by sensors as like objects that are usually overlooked, not really discussed in the humanities, not discussed in media studies extensively, because they are just, you know, components of a technical configuration and they need to work. It is very often, just like with any media, you only notice them once they malfunction, once something doesn't work properly. So if you walk through this revolving door, you will do that like almost naturally and habitualized, because you do that every day a couple of times. When it stops and doesn't like sense you and allow you to enter and to move, then you will notice and think about, okay, what is going on? What is in this? What is built into this setup, into this black box of technology? And that is actually when you start raising media theoretical questions. So that is, and of course, everything that we know, maybe as the last point to raise, there would be a lot more you could say about this. But our idea of nature, of environments, also of endangered environments and species, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and so on, we of course know that by means of media. We know that because, well, the media inform us about it. That would be the representation level, of course. We've all seen certain pictures, certain graphs, certain diagrams and tables come by over and over again, but also in terms of the knowledge production. So it is sensors built into environments, implemented into environments that sense, that inform us about pollution, acidification, drought, and so on and so on. So here, the hardware feeds into our software of thinking about what environments actually are, how to protect them, how to manage them, how to keep them alive.
I think you guys had a bit of a trauma flashback, because in class, it takes me the smallest incentive to start talking about doors. So when you started talking about the revolving door.
It's the Ziegert influence.
The Ziegert influence comes through, indeed. He will appear. But to go back to what I said about the definition of media, I started by saying it is the thing in between. It is always the thing in between that is oftentimes goes unacknowledged. So when you bring up the question of the delineation between nature and culture, here and out there needs to be a drawing line, right? There needs somewhere we cross a boundary, and now we're not in nature, we're in culture anymore. And I will invite all of you to think, where is that? What is that? How does that come to be? And part of the work that we do in our class, and part of this kind of media studies tries to ask, is how do those lines come to existence? What work do they do? And how do they, over time, become invisible because they become so essential, so ingrained that we take them for granted, just like the door? So the line that we think of as given, essential, between something that exists that we call culture, that we built, and this thing that is unbuilt, essential, untouched, that is nature, those things co-create each other. And becoming aware of the line that separates them is the work of media studies, the kind of media studies that we are interested in. And it becomes relevant anytime we talk about different forms of nature and how that changes, and how supposedly humans intervene into a space that they don't belong to, that they created in the first place, because there is no nature as such. It didn't exist before we invented something called culture. I understand that that takes a bit of a couple of mental jumps to get there, but I hope we're getting there in establishing that.
Yeah, I'm sure that we will come back to this theme of the arbitrariness of the line between nature and culture, between science and the humanities again and again. And so I think we should start by addressing some forms of newer media that we're going to be talking about, forms of digital media that have slowly crept into our everyday lives, as you said, without being noticeable. I think that many of us right now are kind of inseparable from all sorts of digital media, for example, the computer, the phone, and even AI. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the transition between the analog to the digital world, and maybe the consequences of this on our everyday lives, and indeed science as a discipline.
I guess that, again, there's a lot to be said about that. So where to start, Erinç? What do you? I mean, I would say, like in terms of my research, current research on sensors, what is interesting about that is, of course, that those are defining, in a way, in a very subtle way, our daily lives and like how we manage and navigate our daily lives. Just think of your phone, which has, like, in whatever model you use, if you're like an Apple person or Samsung or whatever, has like at least 28 sensors built in, operating all the time, without you necessarily noticing. So to end up as a blue dot on a Google Maps map, of course, a lot of, you know, sensor and data communication needs to happen in the background. And that is usually what we not consciously think about. So we have this very personal, almost intimate relation to our phones, which you witness when somebody breaks or loses a phone, which leads to a nervous breakdown in most cases. There is this intimate relation with media. It gets even more intensified if you think of smartwatches, fitness trackers, and these kinds of media that really gather data and process data about your own physical bodily functions to an extent that you believe these data more than maybe your own impression or experience or feeling. Like waking up, like if you think of sleep trackers, for example, waking up in the morning, having a look at your sleep score is like, yeah, okay, so you trust that more, and you are really happy and feel like well rested and regenerated if you have a 90 sleep score, rather than just asking yourself, how do I feel? How did I sleep? Do I feel refreshed? So there is this intimate relationship. We bring these sensors very close to our bodies, even inside our bodies. If you have an implemented sensor, that's of course a lot happening in this area as well. For example, measuring and monitoring blood sugar levels and things like that. So we have that very personal environment of our homes. Think of smart homes, smartifying homes, of our own bodies. That is part of all of this. And then we also have, at the same time, the planetary level. Of course, all these data feed into larger networks, corporation-driven networks. But it's also, it's at the same time a very intimate thing, as it is a planetary thing, remote sensing, using satellites in order to detect changes in environments. So this, how it spans, the range from planetary to most personal, intimate relationships is, of course, one of the aspects that is so fascinating for me.
And I would also add to that, I don't find it particularly helpful to think about a kind of pre-disturbed true version of ourselves that somehow existed in the analog world that then get disrupted by the sudden and perfect arrival of some digital technology that disrupted us. Because, as I said, the boundaries, there is no stable us that was sitting there and then phones came. The pre-phone existence was also mediated through different media, and that was also not this undisturbed, quote-unquote, natural human existence. So the way we exist with our current technological tools around us is just as mediated as it was with different media back now decades ago. But one thing that has shifted, arguably, is in the way to look at media that we tend to look at is the essentially erosion of boundaries between different channels of communication. So looking at you, you're probably not going to remember this, most of you, but we used to have different kinds of media for text and video and audio. We used to have different kinds of media for simultaneous communication versus asynchronous communication, for two-way communication versus broadcasting. A telephone was a different thing than a telegraph, than a radio, than a newspaper. And now all of that gets carried through the same channel. All of that is now digital, and that means they can all transfigure into each other at a moment's notice. And we see, of course, one of the most noticeable ways we see that is we can now speak in colloquial, everyday verbal language to a language model, which then, as a result, produces us realistic video that takes into account what we asked it to do. That transformation erodes the difference between natural language versus video versus computer-generated imagery, and all of that involved in the steps. From the perspective of the computer, there is no difference. And that in itself is a kind of epochal shift that we kind of lived through. But that in itself isn't new. That happened all the way back in the 90s and 80s. That was the impact of computerization. But that is still, we are living through the ramifications of that still. That's what I would add.
Yeah, thank you. And with this discussion of our phones and how the world has always been incredibly mediated, it reminded me of some ideas and writings of Donna Haraway, who is a very prolific writer in posthumanism studies and transhumanism studies, and the idea of the cyborg, who is hyper-dependent on the media and on technology and almost can't exist without it. And I wanted to ask if this feels like a concern for us and in a place in which we're headed, and if this is maybe a bad thing or a good thing.
This is what makes me an incredibly annoying teacher, because I will then reflect by asking, sure, posthumanism and transhumanism and all of those things mean different things, but then we have to then ask the question, what do we mean by human? And for the kind of media that we started by saying, if media is the thing that is in between, and I gave you an incredibly unsatisfying answer about what media are, and then we have to start with an incredibly unsatisfying answer of what a human is. Not borrowing out of Haraway, which is a very specific tradition of thinking about the boundaries of what constitutes a human. There is another tradition of thinking about what we came to know as human is also a product of a specific kind of knowledge production that came out of a specific tradition, which is not the only way to define a human. So if we are questioning the boundaries of how that knowledge gets produced, which is a very Western-centric 18th, 19th, what some people call the Enlightenment way of defining what a human is, if the conditions of that changes, no wonder what we define as the human will change. But that doesn't mean there was anything such as a human in the first place. That was a construct to begin with, and that doesn't mean it won't have ramifications. Of course it does. But that has only some bearing on the actual bodily experience of people. So that would be my first sketch of an answer, and I would love to hear what you have.
Yeah, what I really like about this answer, and your previous one as well, is your strong emphasis on processuality, on not fixed entities. And I think that is the most important aspect to take into account, that we, by using media, we not only bring forward an idea of what media are, but also of what a user is, what a human is, the big questions, and that those are intertwined and constituting each other, never being finished identities, fixed identities, and also not fixed technologies. It is really in the moment of encounter that something new emerges, that's a mutual becoming almost of media, of technology, of humans, of all the entities involved in this network of relations. So the relationality, and in temporal terms, the processuality is really what I think is the most difficult to grasp, maybe, but also the most interesting and challenging to think about.
That was really insightful, and of course, post-human theory is something that's very broad and that may be a concern for us. And so I wanted to combine your previous answers about how the human condition was sort of always historically produced, and also your idea about how everything is connected in relation to each other, to talk more about the relationship that we now see emerging between humans and AI, and how we imagine AI as both human in a way, but also very strangely and uncannily not human. And of course, this idea that we are becoming post-human, if that even is a thing, and how we can view this in the sort of media theoretic lens?
Yeah, that's another big one, of course. Well, I mean, usually I'm very hesitant when it comes to describing technologies, new technologies, upcoming technologies as disruptive, because I'm more like interested in thinking about continuities and discontinuities in media history. But of course, with AI, we all get a sense of it being somewhat, to some extent, disruptive. So I think we are far away from being done with thinking about that and coming up with a media theoretical approach that really captures this development. I think what is clear, and that is a continuity in terms of media history, is that it's another new technology that is presented as disruptive and big and changing everything, and that is met with both at the same time. We can really trace that back in media history, back to the printing press, with a dystopian view of how it changes the world for the better, how it is inclusive, liberating, democratizing, and whatnot. And of course, at the same time, you have always a dystopian view of saying how this will be the end of humanity, basically. So, and I'd be careful with both of these views. Well, media, again, in the middle, in between. The truth is somewhere in between. So we need to come to terms to that. And the question is, if the wording itself is the best we could have come up with artificial intelligence. Just recently read a manifesto, a short text by media archaeologist Siegfried Zielinski, who you might be familiar with as well, who makes a strong plea for calling it artificial extelligence, because it's basically externalized into a language model and not internalized. It is not embodied yet, at least. That might change in the future. But it's an interesting take to, as usual, to start with the very term that we use, with the label we put on it, and all the implications it comes with, and the propaganda almost that it comes with from both sides, like those trying to ban it and keep it at bay, and those entirely embracing it. So these negotiation processes, I think, and that brings up, of course, also corporate involvement, data security, who is in charge, who decides to what extent AI is being included in our daily lives, and so on. That is all going on right now. So exciting times to live in, even though bleak times as well at the same time, but exciting times in terms of these negotiations that are just starting, in my perception.
Indeed. Love the Zielinski quote. What I would add to that is talking about AI and human/post-human can be, and we have to be extremely cautious in that we have the risk of being unfair to both AI and human as definitions, because when we talk about AI as this one thing, some of you probably know more about this than I do, but there is no one such thing as AI that operates as this cohesive unity. We are talking about so many different technologies and so many different paths of development and so many different applications that it is almost reductive to just put it in this one box called AI and treat it as this one thing. And when we discuss the perceived or potential quote-unquote humanity of that AI, it is also trying to put it into, judge it against the benchmark that it is not fair, because there is something incredibly interesting and diverse happening there, and just trying to understand it on the basis of whether this is human-like or not doesn't truly, to me at least, does it justice, because there is something possibly much more interesting going on there. On the other hand, about the humanness, talking about whether or not in the face of AI are we becoming post-human or not, I would again say is unfair to the humanness of it, because to go back to the definition of human and the media that I've been kind of coming back to in every question, from the historical perspective, we would then say, well, we've never been truly human to begin with, would be the answer. Then it becomes the historical question of, okay, who came up with the definition of the human in what moment and in what history? Was that ever a thing that truly fit everyone on the planet, and who did it work for? And to understand, this is why somebody like Friedrich Kettler, who both of us have a bit of affinity with, I would say, always use the term so-called human, because it was always a working definition to begin with. And understanding the historicity of that, the kind of working definitionness of that, has always been to me a very liberating idea, because it was never this static, constant thing that is now being threatened. It was always in motion, it was always shifting, it was always bound to be contingent. And now, with our new technological tools and opportunities, we are once again revising it, not that it was static to begin with. So it's a process, and it's a thing that constantly shifts and moves, and that's okay. That is what it always has been.
Thank you. And building a little bit on this topic of AI, something that it's very adept at is data gathering and gathering information about people at such a rate that a lot of information and a lot of human knowledge is directly at our fingertips. We are very good nowadays at cataloging through either active collaboration through sites like maybe Wikipedia and the encyclopedia, or through AI, which is a bit more non-consensual data gathering. We were wondering maybe what the ethics of both are, what the benefits of both were, and what your thoughts are on everything being always available in this time and age.
Yeah, well, of course, it's exciting as a resource of being able to, you know, not having to go to the library and browsing through like physical analog catalogs and trying to find information there, which was always kind of limiting, but also liberating, because at a certain point you felt like, okay, I've done my bit. I've researched the most relevant texts and documents and archival objects in a certain area, at least like preliminary. But now, of course, it can be very like overwhelming to be thrown into this ocean of data and information. So I think epistemologically speaking, the post-human is maybe well defined by having to make choices and being like, and that is what is also critical thinking means nowadays, I think, because you can find information on basically virtually anything, everything, but how to filter, how to come to, to find reliable information, how to not overload your brain with too much. We know this, like information fatigue or overloads, people feeling the need to detox from their digital technologies, to take a retreat, and so on, to reconnect with themselves and things, concepts like that, always in quotation marks, of course. That is something that we're dealing with, and maybe AI can be a useful tool for like helping to filter, but then the question is based on like whose program, in a way. Huh? And that's open questions again. Unfortunately, I cannot present you a good answer.
The concerns we have about data gathering, privacy, copyright, who gets to use it, to what end, where does it go? Oftentimes when you talk about what seems like topics about technology and even human rights, or things so fundamental as what constitutes a human and everything that goes into that, which sounds like philosophy, it's interesting oftentimes when you look at the history of it, you end up having a conversation with lawyers and regulation and policy. So I would invite everyone who's essentially excited or worried or interested in this to look at the side of it that comes from the legal perspective. What we consider to be intellectual property is a legal construct. It's not a philosophical construct. It came out of a desire to balance authors, who is what is also a legal construct, authorship. It is not a thing that existed throughout history. It is a relatively recent invention. The need to balance between a person's potential benefit from producing a work of culture that we consider to be valuable versus our collective benefit of having access to that thing, which is how we ended up with 20 years plus life of the author as copyright terms centuries ago. The evolution of that and who benefits, what are the policy trade-offs we make as a group of people that live together under a legal construct that we call a state, is how we end up with those definitions. So somebody just yelled really, and I'm like, yes. So when it sounds like we're talking about technology, we sometimes talk about law. When we think we're having philosophical conversations, we're talking about policy. And policy is by definition about trade-offs. So I would invite us to have that kind of historical sense of, okay, who are we benefiting? What goal are we trying to achieve? What is this in service of? And those are choices that we make as a public, as a polity, as a community, as society, as groups that exist. And the kind of challenging role that is now we are living, because decisions that are made in California are now impacting us living in Amsterdam, and regulations that are passed by EU have effect on polities that exist outside of EU, because the technologies are now so pervasive, and people like Benjamin Breton has been written about that for decades. So that is being shifted, and that I find super interesting beyond the specifics of the technology itself. And I would also invite us to kind of take that into consideration.
Yeah, and that media literacy nowadays really means having an idea or being aware of the data you produce and the data that is being gathered and where it ends up and what kind of control you have over it. Well, basically none. In most cases, but it feels so remote, and so like the big questions being discussed in court and at the EU and so on. But of course, it starts with us, with our own use of media technologies and the way that we kind of immerse ourselves in this. So my first plea would always be to almost try to come up with a diary. Giving yourself an overview of like one day in your life, what kind of data traces actually did you produce, and consciously and of course also unconsciously, which is harder to trace and to write about. But for example, there are apps that allow you, well, it's of course solving a technological problem with an app, always, there's an app for that. There are apps that allow you to see like all the processes in your phone. Colleagues from the Technical University in Aachen have produced this Firefox app, which is showing you all the sensing processes, all the data collection processes, the movement of phone, humidity, acceleration, all these things that are inbuilt and automatically happening, even while you are just carrying the phone in your pocket. That would be first, these eye-opening moments. I think we need that. We need to raise awareness of our own data production. Not only the data we use, but also the data we produce and distribute willingly or unwillingly. And that's hard to do. If you start thinking about that and how to do that, it's difficult, but it's important because, and that is one of the things that I find fascinating about the current technological situation, the contemporary condition we are in, is it's almost like something that Mark Weiser, the computer scientist in the early 90s, has almost like with a sense of prophecy announced like in 91. Ubiquitous computing. It is everywhere. And the most powerful computer is, of course, the one that you don't notice, that is just inbuilt in your environment, that is surrounding you, immersing you. And it's what Weiser called a calm technology. So, and that is, of course, nice, seamlessly producing results, transmitting data, and so on. But of course, it is also problematic for our own knowledge production, for our own literacy of those processes, of understanding what is going on if things are so ubiquitous, so everyday, and so calm and in the background, receding into the background more and more, being part of infrastructures rather than something that you don't need to go online anymore. That division of online, offline doesn't make much sense anymore because you are basically online all the time. Like I said before, you consciously choose. Well, when I grew up, you consciously chose to go online, whatever that means, using a modem and a telephone line and whatnot. nowadays apparently people consciously choose to go offline for detoxing, you know, for getting a break from all of that data, information, stress. So that is also part of like how to be able in the first place to understand all these processes that we are necessarily and inevitably part of. Yeah.
So we've touched on a lot of interesting aspects about modern media, which is why we would like to open the discussion up now for questions from the audience. If anybody has questions, anything they want elaborated on, concerns, now is your chance. We have a couple of minutes open for this, and we'll hand around this microphone for that.
Test. Oh, okay. First of all, thank you for the nice panel discussion. It was very interesting to hear about this stuff from a different perspective. I recently finished teaching a course to bachelor students who have been engaging with language models very intensely. And I've noticed that the media literacy of these students changed a lot. So whereas when we read a newspaper, you think of the bias, you think of regulation, etc. I feel like language models are not regulated or perceived in the same sense. I was wondering, what is your perspective on this? Should we regulate this more? And how have you noticed this in your work?
I think I will just start by sharing, I share your sense of concern. The conversation about media literacy and its role in education and what we should be aiming for is extremely tricky. I realize I'm giving a non-answer, but I really don't intend it to be that way. But this is just where my mind goes here. I used to teach a class called New Media Literacies, which now sounds ancient, and it is. It was about 7-8 years ago. And we had this entire genre of literature about how wonderful everything's going to be thanks to the participatory nature of the internet. How people are going to find themselves, and people are going to discover all these new communities, and everybody's going to find their people, and it's going to bring us this wonderful age of connection and active communities and voices being heard, and nobody's going to be alone anymore. And then, I don't know, about 2015 happened, and then we realized, oh, everybody's about to find their people. Not only the people who are just alone, but everybody. And we've been living in the world that we've been living in for the last decade. And we see in some of the most, I don't want to call it disruptive, I'm going to call it violent, communities online, their rallying cry is eerily similar to the rallying cry of media literacy from 15 years ago. Quote-unquote critical thinking, quote-unquote asking your own questions, not trusting what is given to you, but finding your own answers. These were things that we used to use as rallying cries of media literacy and critical thinking, and now they have become rallying points of conspiratorial thinking and some of the most disruptive, in the most violent sense, community building organizations on the internet. And unfortunately, media scholars don't seem to have the answer. The people that I follow, the people that I used to rely on their teaching, have been in this sense of, not panic as such, but a sense of dread. If I had the answer, I would be working at some policy institution, to be honest with you. And we're still grappling with it. This is a bit of a depressing answer, but we're sorting through it. I will start by sharing my concern, and let me think, and let maybe Sebastian speak.
Maybe just to add to that, latching on what you said about the early days of the internet, and basically not speaking about like ARPANET and the very early, like more military industrial complex developments, but when it became accessible to more people. This promise, and here again it is interesting to look at the names, labels, and metaphors being used, like surfing, browsing, the cyberflaneur, cyberspace, and so on. If you remember, if you've heard of those, you're too young probably for that, but that was the promise of like like you said, like you just described, like democratizing, finding each other, a worldwide community, and so on and so on. And then, of course, at a certain point, corporations took over, and it was pretty much striated, organized, channeled into certain ways with search engines, and then the Web 2.0 with like appification of things, social media, and so on, which were all owned by certain people. Now with the way that we encounter artificial intelligence and large language models, that's almost the first step, basically. So it is coming from corporations, right from the start, like OpenAI and so on and so on, all these big tech players. So that makes it maybe even harder to grasp what is going on. But that is definitely something that whenever we think about those large language models, we need to keep in mind or keep questioning. Where do they come from? With what interest? Then, of course, it's always follow the money, and then follow the data. Where are those stored? Where are the servers? Who has access to it? Which kind of backdoors exist? And so on and so on. So yeah, literacy here requires a different kind of like critical thinking, I guess, than in previous times. But then again, not entirely, because media has always been in close connection to certain corporate interests and financial interests. So I'm sorry for not having like a better answer to that.
If there are no other questions, I think we will be moving on to part 2. And to everyone else who's walking around, if you are interested in joining our session right now, you are more than welcome to. And so for this second part of this talk today, we would like to take a more historical view and take a step back through media history and look at the so-called pre-digital age of media. So we have technologies such as the printing press, telegraphs, and different forms of analog media that have been traditionally the focus of media studies. And I think maybe to start, we could continue on the topic of media literacy and the so-called loss of traditional media literacy and skills. As you have previously answered, this is a very complex topic that we don't really have clear answers for. But do you think that there is more to be said about how people are slowly forgetting ways of living with traditional media and not being surrounded by digital forms of technology?
Maybe? Which people? Forgetting what? So, because that is yes, but then there are communities on the planet who went from essentially, I don't want to call it nothing, but didn't come from a traditional mass market, mass media, broadcasting, 20th century media infrastructure, then lived through the transition to dial-up internet and then broadband and then to mobile. There are communities around the world who didn't live through that transition. So from no traditional media infrastructure to 4G, basically. And so we have to think about who are we talking about when we talk about disappearing or changing modes of media literacy, for whom? And what did that look like? So I am very wary to give a blanket answer to that question. It really depends on for whom are we talking about. And change all change is a loss, arguably, but then that also doesn't mean it's necessarily a good and bad thing, and good and bad also implies for whom and under what circumstances. So sure, our habits are changing, our lives, means of existing are changing, our ways of thinking are changing, but that doesn't mean we all came from the same place and we're going to the same place collectively. I'm giving the vaguest answer in the world, but to me, I think that's the point.
Yeah, indeed. And the question of loss is I probably wouldn't phrase it like that, because it's always this process of change and then adaptation, getting used to certain things, other things being pushed into the background. But then there's also this phenomenon that the colleagues of ours do research on, of media nostalgia. Why do people all of a sudden get interested in like analog media again, vinyl records and Polaroid pictures and all these things, like even simulating that. I mean, that is how it started, or partly in the visual culture of like social media, like using filters that made your photographs look like old photographs or like Polaroids and things like that. And now this is really like happening in the market. It's of course a marginal market share, but still there seems to be a certain like desire to reconnect with older media and with the analog, or like whatever you want to call it, which is interesting. I wouldn't say it's a loss, and I would definitely not make this hard, like cut, to build this boundary between analog and digital. That has always been wrong. That has always been kind of imprecise and brushing over too many processes that are happening at the same time. And of course, well, I'm glad that I think that is now established in most parts of media studies and culture studies and environmental studies. Of course, the promise of like virtualizing everything, of going into digital media, making things like seamless and weightless and immaterial and so on. I think this naive belief is over, because we know like the analog costs of digital media in terms of like environmental impact and so on and so on. So that connection, I think this divide that has been like when digital photography came up and became available to everyone, and then of course it is a different sort of referentiality, capturing light electronically compared to capturing light on a surface, on a silver gelatine surface or whatever. But that was, even back in those days, it was the exciting thing to talk about. How analog to digital, we are now at this interesting, watershed in culture. But of course, that has never been really the case. There's always a coexistence of different modes and forms. But you mentioned at the very beginning, like this convergence, of course, digital media being able to almost in a carnivoric way, converge everything, take everything, like turn everything into digital signals and formats. But that doesn't mean that the analog disappears. Yeah? So I would be careful with this cultural pessimist point of view of the loss that we have to mourn.
I don't have a lot to say about this. I just want to kind of flag it for us to collectively think about. I would love to think more about it in the future, personally as well. But this idea that is now, I'm sort of observing in very little of the discourse that I kind of get exposed to, but the idea that how economic privilege manifests in now the luxury of not having to be online. This idea that now you are so privileged that you don't have to be on social media, that it is now the kind of this reactivity of you can afford to not be on social media because you already have a social circle and you already have the social capital. And that I find interesting as a kind of reactive force, and which might also manifest in ways that we might see the privilege as being manifested as you have such privilege that you don't need to dabble in AI-generated slop art. You can actually afford quote-unquote real art. And that becomes a marker of exclusivity, and that I find very fascinating. Again, it's a very emerging trend that I'm kind of just seeing the signs of observing. It's basically the scene from Blade Runner, seeing, oh, is this a real owl, and that is, to me, quite remarkable.
Building on this blurred line between analog and digital media, would you agree that there are still relics of traditional media lingering and almost fossilized in newer tech, to the extent that maybe the analog media, even if it seems a bit more invisible now, was never lost? Yeah.
Of course. So we see maybe fossilization of older media in the way that newer media try to mimic the function of older media without even having to. For example, when you take a picture with your phone, it makes the shutter noise even though there's no actual shutter. And we were thinking if this is a process that you find interesting or if you have any comments about it. And particularly what we were thinking of, if newer media has to be backward compatible with older media, then does this maybe prove to be some kind of obstacle in the innovation of technology? Or is this a way to carry on traditions and make cultural connections with the past, as you said, the growing nostalgia for traditional media?
One helpful way that I would think about that whole issue, and I'm going to avoid answering the question by this, but I find it helpful to go to, so this is a Gittelman, right? Gittelman. I teach her, but I don't know how to pronounce her last name. She defines media as having two components. On the one hand, there is the technological infrastructure, and then there is the social protocols that are around it. And together combined, they make what we recognize as a medium. So a telephone has the part of it that is the physical apparatus that you hold up and speak to in your hand, and then there is the social conventions of what do you use the telephone for? Who uses it? Where do you put it in your house? What kinds of conversations you have on it? And those things sometimes evolve and change at different paces and go to different places. So the social protocols around what we used to use the telephone for may have migrated to a different technological apparatus, which then became the telephone, and the technological apparatus itself, in the way that it was in the 70s and 80s, may have evaporated. What we now call a phone is not the last thing we probably, like, I don't want anyone to call me on my phone. That is the last thing I want my phone to be for. Only my wife is allowed to call me on the phone, please. So, but then I still call it my phone, right? It is the last thing I use it for. So that is a very interesting thing of like cultural relics with us in language. We call it the phone, but it's not a phone. And people have said like we've squandered the term personal computer for the thing that is sitting on our desktop. So it's a way of thinking. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I find it helpful to differentiate the technological apparatus and the social conventions that go with it. I don't know if that helps.
And well, next to this whole like media nostalgia, the sentiment of like you know, missing older media or wanting them to still exist and so on. The things that you described and gave as examples are of course also part of like remediation processes, as like Bolter and Grusin have defined them, that new media always like incorporate certain elements of older media. Because that makes them usable and that makes them like familiar, feel familiar. And if you look back into the history of like media technologies and what producers and industries have done in order to make new media forms, new media technologies acceptable for people, because, well, already talked about, like there's always a dystopian, you know, or a hesitance, a reluctance of, you know, this is new, is it good, will it change the world for the worst, and so on. So you can really trace that back to the like 18th century novel. And that is, of course, something that industries in producing have to take into account. So how can we make a new object exciting, innovative, and like fundamentally life-changing, and you know, all these claims, but at the same time not too alien, not feeling too alien, too weird, too strange, too unfamiliar. Well, television producers have been great at that. As a media historical anecdote quickly, that Lynn Spiegel has like written about extensively when television became a thing, and televisions were like sold like widely and became a thing after the Second World War. It was kind of like there were strategies to make people feel comfortable with letting this new entity into their homes. For example, you may have seen that at your grandparents or something, by putting them into a cage, like into a cupboard, that you could like close and open the doors. So to give you a sense of agency, of like there's a new person in the house, like in your most sacred circle of, you know, your home is your castle and all that, especially after Second World War. And then all of a sudden you had a face looking at you in your own living room. Not just the radio sound, but a picture, an anchorman looking into the camera, into your home. So you rather want to invite and uninvite that person by being able to lock that new technology behind a door. So there's always ways of, you know, mitigating the interest in innovation in technology and the fascination for that, and certain fears that need to be taken into account, which is maybe also why certain elements of like older, familiar, habitualized like media uses are being prolonged into media where it's not even necessary, like the shutter sound that you mentioned.
Thank you. Yeah, and speaking of the preservation of older media and all the sorts of loaded attitudes that we have towards them, I was thinking of how the progression of media history and of technologies that we use to do science has always sort of tended towards a continual sort of desire to become more efficient, to remove noise wherever possible. So from handwritten letters that you couldn't read properly to the typewriter to now the computer. And I was wondering if this is perhaps a natural thing that we will always tend towards the desire to capture as much information without noise as possible, or if this is just a particular trajectory that may not be universal.
To bring it back to the very beginning, there is no such thing as natural, right? This is where we began. But I don't know about the noise and the perfection and all that, because that opens up an entire conversation about what is noise and all that, which I'm not going to get into, because this is my excuse to quote one of my favorite things in the world, which is, as someone who's written his dissertation about the history of encyclopedias, Umberto Eco gave this interview. Were you baiting me to say this quote? Or Umberto Eco he made an exhibition many years ago at the Louvre about the lists. And he curated a whole exhibition about lists at the Louvre. And as part of that, he gave an interview. And in it, he says, and he kind of reframes the conversation about what's a list. The Odyssey is a list. And epic poems are lists. Encyclopedias, dictionaries, all these things, we have this cultural urge to collect. And he says, we see that across geography, we see that across orality and literacy in different media forms. And I like his answer. It's not necessarily the one answer, but it's the one I like. He says, as human beings, we seem to not able to stop collecting and stop making lists, because what's a list? A list is a way to capture infinity. We know we are going to die. We know our lives are finite, and yet the universe is not. And a list is this almost pathetic but very optimistic attempt to capture something that is infinite and put it into something that is comprehensible and capturable and graspable. We make lists in encyclopedias and dictionaries and catalogs and collections and libraries because we don't want to die and transcend infinity. I like that, and that's a nice way to finish it to me, I think.
And that's indeed one of those regimes of order. We are not only striving for efficiency, that is clearly the case. If you think of like a, continuously increasing computing power, speed, miniaturizing things, making them like handheld and more readily available for use in everyday life, and so on and so on. So those processes seems to be, I wouldn't say, of course, natural, but kind of like a logic, inherent logic that if you have a technology, you want to improve it and optimize it in that way. And well, that is certainly part of that story, and like bringing order into the chaos of life by like making lists, for example, and dealing with infinity in such a way. Well, that is really interesting to think about from like media technologies from that point of view, basically. I would agree.
And looking back to a time where optimization wasn't necessarily always prioritized, we wanted to touch on the printing press and what that changed for the trajectory of information, how we spread it, how we share it, and why it has been so important to us. A big topic.
We can
Yeah. I mean, the history and the potential impact of the printing press is one of the most contentious topics in all of media history. There are a lot of opinions about it. I mean, not opinions, there are a lot of positions about where do we put the printing press. It is one of those things that we should recognize. It didn't come out of the ground fully formed in 1455 by Gutenberg, right? There are previous iterations that didn't do the thing that people say it did in that moment. So it's worth asking the question why it was coupled with all the things that it is associated with in Europe, particularly Germany, in the moment that it arrived, etc. So those are all very valid questions. And I can sketch the survey of what people think it contributed to, from what we now today call the scientific revolution, to the Reformation, to emergence of local languages across Europe, unification of German, unification of English, unification of Italian, the emergence of correspondence between today what we call as scientists, because people can record diagrams and data and transport them across different geographies without worrying about data being quote-unquote corrupted by somebody doing a mistake in their handwriting. All of that is attributed to the printing press, but then it is not single-handedly responsible for causing those things. It was its arrival in that particular moment, in that particular time, coupled with the things that were already nascent in that environment that ended up creating those things. So that is why there is a debate among media historians of how much necessarily agency or catalytic power we attribute to the technology itself. I'll stop here and maybe...
Yeah, I think that covers a lot of ground, actually. But maybe, if you allow, cut and jump a few centuries to the invention or the early days. It's not like one invention moment, like in most cases. To the early days of photography, which had or is said to have had a similar impact, like in visual culture, because it allowed observations to be recorded directly without mediation through the hand, skillful or less skillful, of a painter, of somebody making a sketch. You just take a picture and it was presented, of course, you know that, Talbot and Daguerre and all these early inventors of photography as the pencil of nature. All of a sudden you have this new relation to nature where nature inscribes itself into a picture. So you don't need the painter doing that any longer. Yeah, you can get rid of the human element, which is always also a flawed element. So, or one of potentially making mistakes or being imprecise or being biased and so on. I'm just, that is just recapitulating a discourse of the 19th century. So now you had mechanical objectivity, as Destin Gallison have called it. So you finally had images of nature, of the reality, with a direct indexical, relation that are objective because a machine has taken them. Yeah. And that, of course, changes the entire idea of observing nature, of gathering knowledge about nature, about documenting, about certain findings. And then these instruments relatively soon invaded laboratories as well. And people started making them part of the experimentation process. Like a whole new visual culture, a different visual culture of science emerged, in the 19th century with, for example, that was something that I wrote extensively about in German, unfortunately, so you can't read it probably. People like Pasteur, Robert Koch, especially bacteriologists, modern biologists in the second half of the 19th century started really experimenting with coupling two media technologies, the microscope and the photograph, to take pictures of, for example, bacterial cultures, and in that way try to introduce a whole new idea of what evidence is, visual evidence, how you can prove things in a more reliable way than by hand sketching what you saw under the microscope, which caused lots of epistemological questions and media theoretical questions. And for while, if you look at the literature, at the letters and notebooks from the lab of these days, like 1850 to 1900, it's really super interesting because all these biologists and physicists and so on, they all turned into kind of media experimenters and like media theorists for a while, trying to, you know, find the best ways, the most reliable and also spectacular ways sometimes to produce images that would convince a public, that could convince funders and so on. So you have these moments, like the printing press is one of them, photography is maybe another one, in which like a whole new set of skills and is mobilized, but also a new idea of what nature is. So these renegotiations of nature that you talked about, it's a dynamic thing, and it will be a different thing whether you look at it with your own eyes, with the help of a telescope or microscope, or through the lens of a photo camera.
And I think what you've just discussed brings us to a very interesting question in the philosophy of science, namely that media technology have always been at the center of our scientific pursuits, and that without inventions such as the microscope or the telescope or even printing, then possibly science would not have reached where we are today. And so I want to also ask you about how we think of science with cultures that may not have developed traditional media infrastructure. Can we say that those cultures or societies still have their own form of science, or is science necessarily require media in the way?
Which like other culture, you mean non-Western, or like, I mean, this is only one way, this kind of like European Western Enlightenment way of like, you know, coming up with visual evidence and proofs and like documenting and ordering and establishing a regime of knowledge being ordered and categorized and all that. And of course, media technologies have played a central part in that. But I would never assume that this is not happening in other cultures that proceed differently in terms of knowledge production. Because like we discussed before, media is not just the technical media that we know or that we are using or that is part of our European history. Of course, like other elements and other like means of like to use a different word, like means are media too. So that is definitely nothing that is exclusively Western. It's just other ways of knowledge production.
I would say just in terms of every discipline, in a way begins with defining its objects and their methods of analysis. The differentiation between physics and chemistry and biology historically coincides with the moment where different tools were starting to be developed to be able to look into those things in different ways. And before that, they were essentially lumped together as a natural philosophy. So tools enable the creation of objects that enable specific streams of data, which then come back to establish a discipline that is coherent within itself. But then it's not about true objective or not, it's about a specific way of constructing something that is internally consistent. And that is one way of producing knowledge, and other ways of producing knowledge are not more or less valid, and we need to be open about that. And I'm not advocating for some sort of moral or realistic relativism. The material world exists, right? But the ways of making sense of it are going to be different depending on what tools and what systems you use to make sense of it.
Thank you so much. As our audience dwindles, I think it's time for us to bring our discussion to a close. But first of all, this would be the last chance for any questions for our speakers, if anybody has. And if not, we can move on with the outro.
So thank you again for all of your insightful discussion. I was wondering if any of you would like to give some final remarks on any of the topics we've covered. Maybe any resources for people who are curious about this topic, perhaps.
famous last words, or like it's dangerous, a dangerous thing to do. Definitely not possible to conclude by summarizing all that has been said. We've touched upon so many different things, but I mean, going back to the title and like our starting point, this relation to nature, I think that is something that we can, of course, think about and reflect on from like a culture theory and media theory point of view, but I think we need help. So like from the sciences, from people being open for dialogue, because we can, of course, theorize, philosophize, and embed it, and like come up with historical lines of discontinuity or the continuity and so on. But we are, of course, not scientists, and we are not like engineers, and we are not people developing tools and sensing nature by means of these tools and so on. So I think this whole situation and the configuration and the constellation that we talked about, like in so many different, like from so many different angles today, thanks to your good questions, is one that is so complex that it cannot be resolved or like captured by just a monodisciplinary view. So if any famous last words, I would really make a plea for more intensified interdisciplinary collaboration, because as you see, it is about, you need a lot of knowledge of nature, of environmental systems, of ecology and so on, but also about hardware, technology, the raw materials, everything that goes into developing these technologies. But you also need a cultural lens in order to, historicize and embed it in a encompassing narrative in a way. So, well, that would be my last words.
Could not put it any better. I will just say thank you for facilitating this.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
It was our pleasure. And finally, to our audience, we would like to thank you again for coming. We would like to draw attention to the new BètaBreak Instagram page that is on the pillar there. And also, we would like to tell you that the recording of this discussion is available on our YouTube channel after the audiovisual team has sent it to us. And we are also very excited to invite you to the next BètaBreak event, which will be on the 9th of April, and we'll be talking about forensic archaeology. Thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks again.